We're about ready to get started, so if everybody could take a seat. So, good evening, everyone. I'm Doug Roberts, representing PS21, Portsmouth Smart Growth of the 21st Century. It's amazing to see so many people interested in parking policy. Thank you for coming. And thanks to 3S for this fabulous space. PS21 hosts informational events about planning. Most recently, Jeff Speck's presentations on Walkable City. And we believe that people care, because people care about Portsmouth, they not only want to discuss planning and development, but to inform discussion. Tonight's presentation, Parking and Downtown Vitality, Cornell professor Michael Manville, is part of a PS21 spring series related to transportation. The second event will be Tuesday, April 28th, and it will focus on two-way streets, on-street parking, and the pedestrian experience in Portsmouth. The presenter will be Rick Chelman, a consultant who is works nationally and internationally on street design and lives in downtown Portsmouth. And I believe Rick is here tonight. He is here someplace tonight. Rick, wave your hand. There he is in the back. We're working on a third event in May on sustainable transportation, ways to reduce demand for parking, and alternative transportation modes. We hope to do that with Bill Lyons, who is also here tonight. He's a principal technical advisor on transportation planning with the U.S. National Transportation Systems Center in Cambridge. Tonight's guest, Michael Manville, is assistant professor of city and regional planning at Cornell University. His research examines the interrelationship between transportation, land use, and public finance, with a particular emphasis on urban parking policy. His research has been published in major planning and transportation journals and cited in venues such as The Atlantic, The Economist, Slate, and The Washington Post. He has provided advice or presented research on transportation policy to local, state, federal, and UN officials. He has a PhD in urban planning from UCLA, and before moving to Cornell, was a researcher at UCLA's Institute of Transportation Studies. Before we get started, we'd like to acknowledge the organizations and people who made tonight possible. Funding is being provided by the Jeffrey Clark and Martha Fuller Clark Fund of the New Hampshire Charitable Foundation and by contributors to PS21. Additional support comes from the Seacoast Media Group and the Corway Film Institute. Bill Rogers, director, who is at the rear there recording tonight's event. Members of the PS21 Steering Committee here tonight are Karen Marsloff, Peter Vandermark, Joe Calderola, and Patrick Healy. Jerry Zellen and Grace Lessner have participated, but they're away. So at the end of the Professor Manville's presentation, there'll be a Q&A. We'll have a microphone available. And of course, this is being recorded. It is actually being uploaded live. And so it will be on, as soon as this is also, it will be on the PS21 website, PS info, immediately, and it will remain there for the foreseeable future. So, Michael Manville, here he is.
Thank you, and thanks for turning out. People don't usually turn out in these numbers to listen to people talk about parking. I'm going to try and do this because I'm a teacher, which means I pace when I talk. Wow, this is really wrapped around. Okay. One more? Oh, that would have been good, right? The whole mic stand would have gone over. me see if I can find this presentation. Okay, so what I was asked to do was just come in and talk a little bit about the sort of state of academic research, and there is, in fact, academic research on, because people in universities study everything, what the relationship is between sort of keeping a downtown vital and the provision of parking. And so what I'll run through is just sort of some of the big ideas that we've talked about in the last 10 years or so with respect to on-street parking, to what cities should do about off-street parking, including, should we require people who develop property to provide parking with that property? Should cities be in the business of owning and operating off-street parking lots and so forth? All of these are contentious topics, I think, almost everywhere where cities are growing. And so one caveat I will make before I go further into this is that I know nothing about Portsmouth. I grew up in Boston. I took a field trip here once, and I've been here a few times since. Doug kindly sent me some materials about Portsmouth, but nothing I'm saying here should be interpreted as sort of like my opinion about what Portsmouth should do, right? I do have a few examples that I have of Portsmouth. Even those should just be interpreted as like me making a general point, because probably someone in the audience will say, he's totally misinterpreting that fact about Portsmouth. So it's nothing I'm about to say is sort of, every city has its unique factors and idiosyncrasies. So I'll start with just a kind of a big idea, which is that parking is absolutely essential to keeping a downtown healthy. But this relationship between the health of a downtown and parking is not linear, right? The hallmark of a downtown that's in trouble is a lot of parking. And I live in upstate New York. I see a lot of troubled cities. They're full of parking. That's not because, like Tulsa, here's Tulsa in 1978 when it was doing better than it is now, and then this is the same neighborhood about 10 years ago, and I was in Tulsa not too long ago, and it looks about the same. The point isn't that Tulsa destroyed itself by building parking. That's not what happened. Tulsa declined for a lot of reasons. The point is that as it declined, it built more parking. And that's the one idea I want to put in your head is that parking is a low-value land use. It doesn't generate a lot of returns, and so you tend to see it most when there isn't a better use for the land and capital in a given area. And so the main sort of takeaway here is just that your parking policy should support your downtown. If things get tipped the other way and you sort of have a downtown that's sort of oriented around making parking, you're in trouble. So now incidentally, I don't know much about Portsmouth. I'm not worried about this happening to Portsmouth. Tulsa is its own problem. So let's just talk a little bit about what does make a good downtown. And I think the first thing that a successful downtown has going for it is it's dense, right? And that density could be on like a really enormous scale like Manhattan, or just on a sort of a smaller scale like Portsmouth. But the main idea is that a successful downtown, it sells proximity. And it sells proximity by combining a lot of people and a lot of capital on a small piece of land. Just get there, and there's a wide variety of activities and opportunities for you to take advantage of. The second thing that downtowns often have as sort of advantages is that they really tend to maximize their history. The downtowns tend to have, especially in the United States, compared to the suburbs, they have these handsome old buildings. They have this urban design that suburbs don't have, where the buildings come right up to the street. Scarce resource, right? The only way to get a 100-year-old building is to wait 100 years. And so this is an amenity that downtowns have that many other places don't, and downtown policy should be mindful of that and keep it in mind sort of as an advantage. So counterbalancing the advantages of downtown is the main disadvantage, which is congestion. And congestion is just an unavoidable byproduct of being dense. Once you put a lot of people near each other, they're going to start bumping into each other, and that's what congestion basically is. And congestion affects cars most. It affects cars most for two reasons. One is that they're bigger, they take up more space, and so it's harder, when you get a bunch of cars together, it's harder for them to maneuver around each other. And the second is a motor vehicle suffers the most loss in relative speed as a result of congestion, right? That a car can go 100 miles an hour. And when you stick it in congestion, maybe it's slowed down to 5 or 6, and that's really frustrating to the person in the car. If you're walking, and there's a lot of congestion, you can usually avoid it pretty easily because you can just sidestep people. but two, you weren't going that fast to begin with, right? You were going 5 miles an hour, and now you're going 4 or something. And so people cognitively, it was that in dealing with this, it helps to get people out of their cars, right? That the more people are experiencing a downtown and its congestion and its proximity on foot, the better experience they have. And so you can sort of summarize this is that, a successful downtown is one that's going to maximize the benefits of density and minimize the congestion costs. And that means getting people out of their cars. And you can do that you can let them sort of park very easily. They get into downtown and boom, they're in a space, they can get out of their car. Or you can skip that whole thing, and this is a challenge for a lot of downtowns, but the ones that are really successful, you can have people live downtown. And then, you have a vibrant sort of 24-hour community that isn't as reliant upon motor vehicles. But either way, what this does is it makes people less bothered by the congestion. It helps them once they're on the street rather than in the car, they're contributing to that sense of vitality that makes the downtown so valuable because they're walking around. They're sort of part of the atmosphere. And of course, they're more likely to patronize a business. Right? If you have to choose where you want someone to be in your downtown, you want them on a sidewalk where if they notice something, they can duck into a store or a restaurant rather than in a car kind of fuming because they can't find a place to park. And no matter what they see out the windshield, they can't go in there and spend money. So this brings us to the parking problem. And I think that cities are in a tough position with respect to parking because they're being pulled in a lot of different directions. And so there's sort of there's 3 different goals that kind of come with parking policy. One, we want parking to be easy to find. There's often pressure to make it cheap. And then lastly, cities want it to be a reliable source of revenue. And the trouble is that you can't have all 3 of these, right? If parking is easy to find and cheap, it's not a reliable source of revenue. If it's a reliable source of revenue, it probably isn't cheap. But the classic example of this is the meter holiday bag that cities used to put out, which is that you put in the parking meter, and the idea is that, when you're metering parking, it makes it easier to find. It also raises money. But then on the busiest day of the year when everyone's going to come Christmas shopping, you put a bag over it, and now suddenly it's cheap, but you can't find it, and it's not raising any money. And it's just, and it's an understandable impulse, but it just shows that when you're juggling these 3 goals, it's difficult. And I think part of the difficulty, see, this is, we're back at Tulsa, because I just like this picture. This is cheap and abundant parking, right? There's no revenue there. So don't do that. Don't be Tulsa. So I think part of the difficulty is that over the last 50 years or so, cities have kind of lost track of what the original purpose of parking meters was. This is not a perfect analogy, but parking meters should be thought of in much the same way as electric meters, which is just to say that they're a very common, non-controversial, right, instrument that large institutions use to allocate public infrastructure. Right? The purpose of an electric meter is to make sure that when people want electricity, it's there. Right? Yes, electric meters raise revenue. But the reason the electric company charges for electricity is because it doesn't want shortages of electricity. Right? They want it so that, when you go turn on your lights, they turn on. And so most people, nobody likes paying for electricity, nobody likes paying for anything, right? But they deal with this because they know that the counterfactual is they don't have electricity. They see it as a fee for service. And that's what we've lost track of with parking policy, because over time, we've come to sort of, just in general, I used to live in California, and in Los Angeles, the city officials sort of viewed the parking meters as these poles that collected coins, right? It's like, I don't know what they're there for, but they're good for $12 million a year. They just came to see them as a source of revenue. And the drivers didn't feel like they got any, right? The purpose of a parking meter is, yes, you pay, but in return, you don't have to circle the block for a space. Like, it's there waiting for you the same way the electricity is there waiting for you when you flip the switch. Once that understanding is broken, right? Once the driver stops thinking of the parking meter as something that gives them a parking space, and they just see it as a pole that takes their money, they think of it as a tax, or they think of it as theft, and they hate it. And so the challenge is to move us back toward understanding of parking as not a way the city raises money, although it can raise money, right? And that's good. But first and foremost is a way to deliver a high-quality service to drivers who are coming into your city, right? The same way the electric company does. And now, when I say that parking is public infrastructure, there's an important distinction to be made here. Parking is public infrastructure. It is not what an economist would call a public good, right? A public good, took Econ 101, is a good that sort of has to be provided by the government or by a nonprofit because you can't. And the technical definition is it's a good that's non-rival and non-excludable, which means that even if one person's using it, so can a bunch of other people. That's what non-rival means. And non-excludable means that once it's there, anyone can use it. And so the classic example is a lighthouse, right? You can't make money building lighthouses. It's going to cost you a bunch of money to build it, and then once it's there, any ship can use the light, and just because one ship is using it doesn't mean that another one can't. Like, you don't see ships coming into the harbor and say, I got to wait my turn to use the light, right? So this is an example of something that the government just about has to make. Parking spaces, on the other hand, are private goods, right? They're rival and they're excludable. If one car parks in it, no other car can, and you can stop people from using it if you want to. And the perfect evidence for this fact is just that most cities have some form of private paid parking. There's a thriving market in parking. So all that means for us to understand, the takeaway for this is that it makes life easier when we deal with it, because one of the most common complaints in cities is we have a shortage of parking. And I think that's actually, that can be easier to evaluate with a private good, because with a private good, if you have a shortage, what you should see happening are two things. One, the price should be going through the roof, right? And two, people should be building whatever you have a shortage of, right? So that if we have a shortage of parking, you should, unless other things are going on, and I'll come back to this, what you should see is that the price of parking is extremely high because the demand is outstripping the supply. And that should be sending a signal to people, private entrepreneurs or whoever, that, hey, if I build some parking, I could get rich, right? And so, and that's why a lot of private goods, like shortages of them, sort of are self-correcting. So for instance, if someone was to come to, into Portsmouth and say, we have a shortage of restaurants, I mean, nobody would expect the government to open a restaurant, right? Because we just said, well, somebody understands now they can get rich if they open a restaurant. And the analogy isn't perfect, but it's not bad because restaurants and parking spaces are similar types of private goods. They're what's called perishable goods. And what I'm not, this is not a comparison with a Twinkie or anything. A perishable good is just a good whose value can't be stored, that it's sold in increments of time, and so you're either going to lose money. And so with a parking space, you sell it by the hour. And so if nobody is, or by the minute, right? So if nobody's in that parking space for 15 minutes, you've lost revenue, right? That value isn't stored. You can't go back and charge the next person double. And so also in this class of goods is, or like another attribute is that the supply is fixed, that adding new capacity is very expensive. And so that's certainly true of parking spaces. It's generally true of restaurant seats. It's true of many other things. So we're talking about hotel rooms, airline seats, rental property, anything where constructing a new one is very hard, and if you don't sell it, you've just lost money. You can't go back. It's a perishable good. And if we look at how the private sector manages perishable goods, we can get some ideas about good management of parking. So one thing that often is done is that you sell the same product for different prices at different times, right? And so sort of in restaurants where you get an early bird special, or movie theater seats, which are also perishable goods, you get charged less for matinee. Like, you recognize that you want to get the maximal yield out of your perishable good, and sometimes it's just not as valuable as others, so you sell it for less. The other thing you can do is you can sell at different prices to different people at the same time. This is what happens when a private business validates your parking. Right? You pay less than the person next to you because you bought something at their business. This is the entire story of airline pricing, right? You could easily be sitting next to someone on an airplane who paid $200 more than you for the ticket because the airline figured out he was a business traveler or something. This is how perishable goods tend to get managed. But private operators, in general, do this more than cities do. And in fact, one of the hallmarks of urban parking is that in most places there just isn't as much private provision of parking for sale as you would expect. That, you know, considering that they are a private good, that there is an entire sort of management science devoted to making money off them, you just don't see private entrepreneurs flooding into parking the way you would expect, particularly if there was sort of a shortage of it or if they're in high demand. So why doesn't that happen? And I think it doesn't happen for a few reasons. And this goes back to what I said before, which is that with a private good, if you have a shortage, unless something else is going on, you should see the price go up and then new people invest in parking. The something else that's going on might be there is a large segment of the market that is price controlled. Right? If you took Econ 101 at any point and didn't repress the memory, oftentimes what causes a shortage is a control on prices, where the good is being sold for less than its market value. And what that means is that even though there isn't enough of it, and the fact that there isn't enough of it is a result of the fact that it's being sold for too little money, no one has any incentive to come in and try and sell more of it because they're always going to be underpriced. And so in a lot of cities in the US, some private investor who has some capital and is trying to think of what to do and says, well, maybe I should start a parking garage, faces three factors. The first one is they face competition from a monopoly. And the monopoly is the city government that controls all the street parking. Street parking is like the ground floor real estate of parking, right? It's the parking spaces that provides the easiest access to the street, so it should be very valuable. But oftentimes, in most cities, a lot of it isn't priced at all, and some of the highest value locations are underpriced. Secondly, they might face competition from a subsidized entity if a city runs a municipal parking lot and sells those parking spaces for below market price. And third, and this is probably least common, these two are very common, is that you get competition from zoning, which is that if the city compels through minimum parking requirements all the property owners to provide parking spaces when they develop property, well, if you're a private investor, what you're looking at is saying that as long as this place continues developing, the city is going to mandate a continued supply to drive down the price of what I'm going to build. So when those three factors are taken into account, most private investors just say, well, there's a better return for my capital, right? That I should build something else. It would be somewhat similar to if you were thinking of building a restaurant and you went to a bank and the banker said, tell me about the location, and you said, well, across the street they're giving away free food, and next door they're giving away free food, and every new house comes with free food. I mean, the banker would probably say, you should probably invest in something else. And so that's, I think, why we see sort of less investment on the private side than you would predict. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about each of these problems and why we do this and why maybe some pathways out of it. So the issue of underpriced curb parking, right? So again, curb parking is a monopoly good. It's owned and controlled entirely by the government. And so the government, understandably, often faces some pressure to just not make it very expensive. That's completely rational. But the problem is that underpricing of street parking, like underpricing of almost anything, leads to two problems. It leads to shortages and it leads to misallocation. It leads to shortages because some spaces are simply more valuable than others, right? The parking spaces right near the most popular part of the downtown, people value those more than right on the edge. But if they all cost the same, then that means that the most valuable ones are selling for less and you're going to run out of them. You're not going to have vacancies. It also means that they're not going to get allocated to the people who value them the most. And so the classic example of this in U.S. downtowns is that those street parking spaces where you want to just have a steady turnover of high-spending customers, the first people to get there during the day are the employees of the stores, and they just park there, right? And that screws the whole thing up, and the spaces don't turn over. So, and then compounding that is that once you do have a shortage, this leads to the problem called cruising. And cruising is when you get to this space that you really want, and you realize there's no vacancies, but you know that if you just luck out and someone pulls away, you'll score this great spot for less money. So you just start circling. And once people are circling the block, this is extra vehicle travel, it's extra congestion, you're slowing down the people behind you because not only are you driving, but you're driving in the world's most annoying way, right? Because you're just kind of, is he leaving? Is he leaving? You know. And so you end up with, going back to what makes a downtown successful, you have more people in their cars frustrated than out of their cars enjoying themselves. And I just want to point out that underpricing can happen in a variety of ways, right? So the most obvious would be that you just don't meter your streets at all, right? And I think in most cities, most spaces aren't metered. The second would be that you have meter rates, but you don't adjust them properly, so that at any given time, some segment of them just aren't high enough to sort of maintain this a minimum level of vacancy. And the third way is that you turn the meters off too early, right? Which is also a problem in many downtowns, which is that you have a thriving restaurant business, or there's a movie theater or something, but the meter turns off at 7, so the price goes way down, but the value of those spaces actually goes up, right? Because restaurants are valuable at night. That's when people want to get to them. And so you can try and correct all of those, but that's cumulatively, what it means is that at any given time, a number of your spaces are mispriced, and if they're underpriced, you're going to have these shortages, and people are going to get mad. So, and one thing that happens when folks get mad is they call for the government to make sure that anyone who builds anything provides parking with it, right? It's a minimum parking requirements, which are in the zoning codes of almost every city, are a response to this problem, right? Let's make sure these new people provide parking, even though we, the existing people, are using up all the parking. As you can see, I'm not a huge fan of minimum parking requirements. And the trouble with them is twofold, I think. The first one is that we've had minimum parking requirements now in almost every city for a long time, at least 50 years in almost every city in the country. They don't serve the original purpose they were supposed to, which is that they don't prevent the street spaces from filling up. And they don't do that because, again, these are the most valuable spaces. People will go to the street spaces first, in general, and then they'll go looking for off-street parking. They tend to be a very inefficient way to provide off-street parking, right? If you want to have more off-street parking in your city, doing it parcel by parcel, and some of these parcels, especially in downtowns, are very small, they're hard to work with, you're gonna pay a lot per parking space. And you're gonna compromise some of these lots and the ability to develop on them, and that's gonna harm the density of your downtown because you're not gonna get as much activity as you want there. And so this is, let me just give you a quick example. So this is sort of your typical pre-World War II. That was not something I expected to happen. Okay, typical sort of pre-World War II building, and let's say it's 100 square feet, and I would take, I'm kind of spitballing with these numbers, but let's say I could use it to build 12 500 square foot apartments and leave some space aside for a lobby and hallways and so forth. That's a pretty efficient use of my building, and of course I'm maintaining this nice downtown sort of look. It comes right to the street. There's some nice trees on the sidewalk, etc. If I was to put a minimum parking requirement in place, like a 1.5 space per unit minimum parking requirement, well, an off-street parking space at the smallest is 300 square feet, because it's not, you can't just build a parking space. You have to build the ramps and entryways for the cars to get to and fro. And so when you put that in, well, 500 square feet times 12 apartments times 300, I can't use most of that space, right? So what might I do? I might skip the slide again. Okay. It might end up looking something like this, right? That you end up instead just using 52% of the lot and only building 8 apartments. And notice that once you're only building 8 apartments, they're not going to be 500 square feet anymore, right? Because you're at a different price point. Now you've got to make this money off that piece of land with fewer apartments, so they're going to be bigger, and they also have to be priced and aimed at the kind of household that has more than one vehicle a household, right? And so you've lost a lot of building space, you've lost a lot of density, you've gained 12 parking spaces, netted 11, because you had to build a driveway, and now you've lost a public parking space that would have got the city revenue, right? And if this was a historic building, you probably couldn't do this at all, right? You'd have to destroy the building or knock it, or just leave it vacant. And a lot of historic buildings in the U.S. sit vacant because of parking requirements. So when you have, so this is just a quick comparison. If you had like a 1.5 space per unit parking requirement, For a 1,000 square foot apartment, which is awfully big, this would be your ratio of living space to parking space. As you got lower, you can see how it gets harder for it to pencil out, down to the point where something that's kind of reasonably sized for a, your typical sort of middle income or working class income person, a 500 square foot apartment, you're building more parking than you are housing, right? And so you end up with this situation. If you have these high downtown parking requirements, you're going to make it hard, almost, to build parking for people who don't own cars, right? Because every housing unit has to come with parking spaces, which means only people who want cars are going to want them. But that's exactly who you don't want living in your downtown, right? Downtowns are best for people who want to walk around. You're also going to make it hard to build small housing, because again, it won't pencil out. So take that together, and you've just realized that maybe it's going to be harder for you to build housing in your downtown for a lot of your employees, right? It's because it's going to be housing that's going to be pretty expensive. And it's hard to work on small lots with a minimum parking requirement because, it's going to eat up too much of the space. It's hard to work with old buildings, even though a lot of downtowns have old buildings. So you're going to undermine your historic assets. In some, you just get sort of fewer, bigger, expensive units for people who drive. It's an unintended consequence for sure, but it is very much a consequence. It's been documented many times that this is one of the results of parking requirements. So, but if you don't have these, right, the question just becomes, well, what do we do about off-street parking? So, and so this raises the question, well, should the city, the next step is the city builds a public garage. A lot of cities operate public garages very successfully. So this is always a loaded question, and you can certainly find people who say no, the city should not operate public garages. I'm an academic though, so I don't say things like that. I say maybe. That's my answer to everything. It drives my students insane. But if I said yes or no, the test would be too easy. So the main issue is this, right? That if you ask me do I want would I trade minimum parking requirements for a city-owned structure? In a heartbeat, right? They're way more efficient. I don't want people building parking parcel by parcel. If you can build a city-owned structure, you get economies of scale. It's a lot cheaper to build 400 spaces in one space than to make 40 different housing developers build a bunch of spaces that may or may not get used well, and so on and so forth. Also, when you do a municipal structure, or just a structure in general, right, you can make sure that the ground floor has retail. It can come with a liner building. You can have better control over the urban design. And when you just have all your parking in one place, you can also just sort of make sure more people are walking, right? When every building has parking attached to it, people can just drive right up to the building, and there's not a lot of pedestrian circulation. Centrally located parking structure, this is something that is going to generate a little bit more pedestrian activity. So I think that's a huge argument in favor of sort of, if you're going to have devote parking in your downtown, structured parking. Then someone might just say, well, why not just price the street correctly, right? And then if you do that, the private market will build the garage for you, right? Just get rid of this underpricing, and the city doesn't have to spend money on it. This might be an advantage of a garage, but we could maybe get that and not have to spend public money if the private sector is willing to provide it. I think there's one argument against that, which is sort of the kind of wonky title. There's a difference between the private optimum and the social optimum, which is to say that when a private entity operates a parking structure, their goal is to maximize profit, right? That's what we expect private operators to do. A public operator has a different mission, right? If you build a municipal garage for the sake of the downtown, your goal should be, right, to manage occupancy, to get the most people in and out of that garage so that they can circulate through the downtown and just sort of make the city healthier. These are correlated, but they're not necessarily the same goals. It's entirely possible, if you talk to people who operate private parking garages, that you can make the most money off them by keeping your garage half full, right? And that doesn't usually happen, but if you only have sort of one garage in an area and it's a monopoly, then that private operator can make a lot of money and just those spaces will be underused. That can be solved if you have a little bit of competition, but I think it's worth remembering that a profit maximizing price can leave a garage pretty empty. So I think that's the one piece of evidence in favor of, or one big piece of evidence in favor of having a city operated garage. Now, the key here is that the city has to manage the garage for occupancy. It can't think of it as a source of revenue, right? Because if the city's just thinking about it as a source of revenue, it might also leave the garage. So, counterbalancing that is that there are, of course, risks to a city going and building a big parking structure. You know, the first one is I think we can learn something from the private sector, which is that adding supply is often, for a private parking operator, the last resort. Again, this goes back to what I was talking about. How do you manage a perishable good? You play with the prices, right? It's the first 10 things you try, and then if you're still not getting the sort of the return you want, then you would think that adding supply. So you know the first thing American Airlines doesn't do when it's experiencing a shortage is build new airplanes, right? It starts fiddling with its pricing. It has these sophisticated pricing algorithms. And in part, that's because adding supply is expensive. You know, structured parking can easily cost $20,000 a space. It can cost a lot more in a lot of places. $20,000 probably close to the U.S. average. It also has a high opportunity cost, which is, again, downtown land often has more valuable uses than storing empty cars. Now, sometimes that is what you have to do, but it's just a note of caution. And then lastly, of course, like you take on municipal debt, and there's risk involved in that. If you sign some sort of, you know, you did 20 years of debt or 30 years of debt, a lot can happen, right? You know, so that there are technologies now that this is speculative, that people think that in 10 or 20 years we're going to need a lot less parking. That if Uber and Lyft grow the way that they're supposed to, and all the companies that spin off from that, you know, a lot of vehicle trips aren't going to end in a parking space. And if you had told me 25 or 30 years ago that, you know, when I needed a ride somewhere, I could reach into the phone in my pocket and use the internet to get a ride in someone else's private car, I mean, I guess my first question would have been like, I can have a phone in my pocket, and then what's the internet? But you know, so a lot can happen over the life of, you know, a long-lived structure. You know, less speculatively, of course, is just that when you have recessions, if you pay for the garage through parking revenue, when a recession comes along and people are driving less, you know, San Francisco, Los Angeles, these cities got in trouble in 2008 because they were paying down a lot of stuff with their parking revenue, and it just dried up. And you can cross-subsidize, of course. You know, Los Angeles does this. You know, you use your meter revenue to pay for your garages. One, you get in trouble if the meter revenue dries up. But two, and this is more important, once you start saying that your meter revenue, right, has to hit a certain target to pay off your garage, you're not pricing for occupancy anymore. You're pricing for revenue, right? And so you run the risk, again, of charging people too much or too little, and the parking space is no longer this fee-for-service. You've lost sight of this main idea that you price the parking space so that when the driver shows up, he has a vacancy, right? And if in the back of your mind you're saying, yeah, all right, this is the price that gets me a vacancy, but actually this is what I need to pay for X, Y, or Z, there's that conflict arising again where you want it to be available, but also you need it to be a source of revenue. And so I think those are the risks. So there's two ways to think about it. The final point is that, see, here's one of my examples from Portsmouth, and so if I misinterpret it, forgive me. Point. And this is, you know, I can talk about Santa Monica, I can talk about even my town of Ithaca with this, which is that it's often a permanent solution to an intermittent problem, which is that it's rare that your shortage of parking is all day, right? That you know, you say we need a new garage because the garage is full. Oftentimes, like this is or it's just part of the day, but once you build a structure, it's there, and it's occupying that land. And so this news story about your garage, it says that the city's parking garage closed 191 times for an average of 105 minutes. And, you know, of course, I don't know what the standard deviation is, so there might have been times when it closed for 3 hours. But so that's about 20,000 closed minutes, right? It is a 24-hour, if I'm not mistaken, parking garage, so it's open 525,000 minutes a year, which means that it's full about 4% of the time. And if you take out the evening, it's maybe 8% of the time. Again, this is just a general point, so if I've misinterpreted that news story, blame the reporter. Um, but the main point is that this is the kind of thing that you can probably tweak, right? And that if I know a lot of people who work in the parking industry privately, if they looked at numbers like that, they would just say, I'm playing with the price and see if I can solve this, right? Because I don't want to have to invest a lot of capital if I can just solve it some other way. And this as well, and we were talking earlier about Brookline, right on the border of Boston, has this intermittent parking problem when there's Red Sox games, right? There's about, 120 Red Sox games, as home games, 65 or something a year. They solved it by just cranking up the price of their street parking on game days. And you can sort of see here that if you park for 1 or 2 hours on this street during a Red Sox game, you pay the normal rates, $1 an hour. If you park for 4 hours, it's $22, right? Which is basically, and they're going to make some revenue by doing that. They figure it's going to make them $35,000, but that's not why they do it. They do it to make sure that the people who are parking there are the high turnover customers they want for their businesses, right? That's why if you park for 1 hour, you just pay $1. But if you're clearly there because you're parking for the whole Red Sox game, they're going to take a lot of your money. It's a way to just allocate and manage their existing spaces without having to spend a lot of money. And so it's the first instinct, I think, or the first question you can ask yourself is, well, can we solve this problem by making money instead of spending it, right? Can we raise our prices when demand is high? And so this is the sort of rule of thumb that I think that the private sector uses, and a lot of people in my business sort of have arrived at through the studies, is that, cities can build. But the first things they should try are vary your street parking rates by time and place. Use that, see if you can use the unused capacity on the street. Operate your meters later or more if they're necessary. Try variable parking in your garages. And then eliminate your parking requirements. So, and I'm fully aware as I say that all of this is politically not easy. It's easy for me to say it, but I think it seems like the more prudent course. And San Francisco in the last 2 years ran an experiment with dynamic price street parking, and the basic logic of it was that it's sort of illustrated in this diagram, which is that in their central business district, oftentimes the price was too low and it was totally full. But 2 or 3 blocks away, there might be 2 or 3 open spots, which suggests that the price there is too high. And so what they did is they would look at occupancy data, and every 8 weeks, they would nudge the price up or down. The price never went up more than 25 cents. It never went down more than 50 cents. So it wasn't a shock to the system. But what they gradually moved to was that even in the busy spots, right, you always had an open spot. And then you were using 3 blocks away that used to be more empty, now you were using that asset better, right? And so you didn't have to add new capacity because you were just taking advantage of the fact that there's all this variance block to block and street to street. So this is, Doug sent me this. It just shows sort of the occupancy rates for some of Portland, and they're very high in some places, right? Like 91, 89, 84. I think that if you were shooting for something that was like 85%, that would suggest, it's bumped the prices up a little bit. But at the same time, down over here, you only have like a 36% occupancy rate. Well, the price there is probably too high. And so maybe you can bump it up. And I think the even more important point is just that, even looking at average occupancy can be sort of deceiving, right? Because let's say that you have a situation where, you go out and you take an average occupancy, or you look at 10 meters, and you look at them from Thursday to Saturday, 7 p.m., and the average occupancy is 77%, which is high, right? That suggests that maybe, that's a little bit low. It suggests that maybe you could even reduce the price. So, but that's 7 hours a day for 4 days, 1,600 minutes, 1,700 minutes. So 77% means that you've used about 1,300 minutes. But what you don't know, just looking at that, is the distribution of use, right? What you don't know is whether that means that at all times there's a 77% level of occupancy, or that maybe it's just 100% full on Saturdays, and on Thursday afternoons it's largely empty, right? Because there's somewhere in there is about, is a lot of minutes that aren't being used, which suggests, again, just that there's a lot of variance over time in the demand for parking, and if you tweak the price, Maybe the price on Thursday should be a little lower. Maybe the price on Saturday should be a little higher. You're going to find a lot of parking where you thought there was a shortage. And this is, yes, okay. So this is after about 2 years of the price changes in San Francisco. This is over near the Embarcadero. The only thing I want to point out is that a couple things. One, so before noon on this little block, the price of parking here is $1.50 and here is $2.50. So for one thing, just right around the corner from each other is $1 difference in parking, because there's a business there or something that's, a lot more popular than that one. Then when noon hits, the price of parking becomes $4.25 on both of them. And this is demand driven. This is based on when people are going there. Why is that happening? Who knows? I mean, it's possible that this is just a lunch spot, right? That there's not as many businesses open before noon and there are more open after noon. But because the market for parking is so local and does vary so much across time, it does suggest there's a lot of potential to just vary the price, get vacancies up, and also make some revenue. So obviously, that doesn't raise prices constantly, right? There's obviously going to be this trade-off between like the just right price and stability. You don't want to drive people crazy if they come one day and the price, another day the price is $4. But by gradually nudging it back up and down, you can kind of get to the outcome you want, which is, again, where people show up and in exchange for their money, they find a parking space. So this means sort of vary your prices by block if you have to. Vary them by time of day. Just divide the day into morning, afternoon, and evening. Change them by the day of the week, right? If you notice more occupancy on a Saturday than on the weekdays, and then adjust them. Keep track of the data and adjust them every 2 months, every 3 months, whatever. Newer meters make this a lot easier. Newer meters also allow you to give your residents discounts, right, if this is going to be difficult to swallow. There's different ways to do that, and I think it's not nearly as difficult as it once was, but the main point is you want to price your parking to maintain vacancy, right? That's the step you have to take. Objections to this, I think, are many. One is just that people don't like parking meters. The other is a fear that if meter rates go up, your higher priced parking is going to drive away businesses. And third, I think that there's also often a concern in downtowns that you want to keep your parking free or at least very cheap because some of your employees who work downtown don't make a lot of money. I think all these are understandable, and I'll try and touch on each one of them. If you raise the price of parking, is it going to cost you business? Yes. If for no reason at all overnight the price of parking goes from $0 to $12, people will not come. If, however, you just set your price of parking so that you can maintain some average occupancy, right, and you're not going to shock the system, but if you just want to make sure that, the parking is the lowest, means the spaces are 85% occupied, then by definition you haven't chased business away, right? Most of the spaces are full, and the people you have chased away are probably the most price-sensitive people. So if you're a merchant, they're, frankly, the people you wanted to chase away, right? I mean, that's, it's not necessarily socially the best outcome, I think, in terms of maybe equity or something, but if you're a merchant and you're concerned about it, those weren't going to be the high spenders. The other point is that customers don't go places just because they can park free, right? You can park free in a lot of places. If customers just went places because you could park for free, then they would go to Tulsa a lot. And this is especially true of unique places, right? I mean, like a place like Portsmouth doesn't have a lot of easy substitutes. If someone has decided they're going to come to Portsmouth, right, and which means, frankly, that they've committed probably to spending a lot of money in Portsmouth. You're going to go to a nice dinner. You're going to do this. You're going to do that. A couple extra bucks for parking probably isn't going to be the deal breaker. And this is true even of malls. When people go and examine sort of, why do people go to suburban malls rather than to downtowns? I think a lot of planners for a long time said it's because they can park easily, and that definitely has something to do with it. But when people survey mall goers and so forth, mostly people liked malls because they were clean and well maintained, right? That it was a very controlled environment and people were drawn to that. It had less to do with the abundance of free parking. And really, meters offer a solution here too, which is frankly that meters generate a lot of money, right? And you can use that money in ways that both mitigate political opposition and make your downtown even better. So I think that oftentimes people are suspicious of meters because they feel like the money is just going to disappear into the general fund. Now, as someone who has worked in city governments and likes city governments, when someone says that, I say, well, the general fund's important, right? That's not a message that goes over very well. So I do think that if you can use the meter revenue for visible benefits in the place where it's raised, the opposition to meters goes down quite a bit. That you can dedicate the revenue to new street trees, steam cleaning the sidewalks, new security, new wayfinding, new street lights, whatever it takes to make people understand that this is going to deliver a benefit to them. And I think that the big example of this is Old Town Pasadena, which used to be in very bad shape, and they wanted to put meters in primarily because employees were just parking in front of all the stores, and the merchants said, we don't want to do that, we're going to lose business, and the city said, we will give you all the meter revenue. We'll give you all the revenue. You can start what's called a parking benefit district. The merchants will control it. Property owners and merchants control it. They decide how it's going to be spent, and the merchants said, put in meters and run them till midnight. And that's what they do now, and it raises millions of dollars. And they sort of deliver. These signs are up on their pay stations that just says, like, look, you're paying for a parking space, but this is what you're getting. Like, Old Pasadena is financed by your parking. And I think it goes a long way toward sort of short-circuiting some of these objections. Does it completely get rid of them? Of course not. People don't like to pay for parking. There's no question about that. Go a long way. The issue of employee parking is a trickier one. And I think that the first question you have to ask yourself is, well, does the city want to subsidize the employees who drive? And there's no right or wrong answer to that. It's a political question. But if the answer is yes, then the question is, well, does it want to do that by just keeping all parking low-priced or all parking free? And I think that the all parking sort of low-priced is that you're going to help a lot of people who don't need the help. Right? I mean, the classic story is sort of like if the price of parking goes up in the downtown, then the person who works for a relatively low wage, washing dishes or something, is going to have a real difficult time getting to work. Right? And that's an undue burden, and I think we should all be concerned about that. But if the way you solve that is to take a parking lot and just say it's entirely free, without figuring out who's actually using it, well, yeah, you might end up helping a dishwasher or someone like that, but you might also just end up helping the guy who, is the manager of the bank, but because it's a free parking space, right? And so it's not a very targeted subsidy, and everyone is going to act like they need the subsidy as long as the parking is free, right? I mean, so you're not putting people in a position where they have to reveal whether or not they really need free parking, right? Because there is no price signal. And then the final question is, well, if you're going to do this, what are you going to do for the employees who don't drive, right? Because the people who are saving you the most are the people who walk to work. They're not using parking spaces. The people who are riding. But if you're building parking and keeping it free, that's a much bigger subsidy that has higher than to probably the behavior that has the lowest cost and is probably also used, at least in part, by the people with the least means, right? Like walking is mobile. So are there ways around this? Some, right? I mean, one thing you can do, you can just lease all your spaces. There's no free, you can say there's no free spaces, right? If you're trying to manage your vacancies, but we lease spaces to businesses and then let the businesses figure it out. Like if a business comes to you and says, if I don't have free parking for these 3 employees, like they just can't come to work. Well, that sounds like the business needs to lease 3 parking spaces and give them to those 3 employees. That the business knows best. It knows their employees best and knows which employees they need the most. So it shouldn't be like, why should the city have to worry about it? A slightly more complicated way to deal with it is to institute some sort of cash out program. And the cash out program is basically that when businesses lease spaces from the city, maybe they do it for 6 months or 7 months or whatever. But tied to that lease agreement is an idea that if employees don't use the space for the coming month, the money goes back to the business, and the business has to give the cash value of that space to the employee. So this is actually a law in California for businesses that rent their spaces. And the logic behind it is that, one, I mean, all of a sudden, people have a reason to really think about whether they need to drive to work, right? Because suddenly there's an opportunity cost to driving to work. If I drive to work, I don't get $125 extra a month, $150 a month, whatever that lease agreement is. So suddenly what you see is people carpooling a lot, right? I think there's a sense in our mind that says like, oh, if people can't drive and we don't have a train, people can't move. No, almost no one in America takes trains. It's like 0.5% of all trips. The most common way of getting around after driving by yourself is driving with someone else. Just that we usually have no incentive to do it. So you see more carpooling. It also treats all commuters equally, right? So, I mean, if you decide to walk, you get $125. If you decide to drive, you get a parking space worth $125. So you're not sort of like singling out drivers for a benefit that other people don't get. It also frees up garage space, right? If someone takes advantage of this, and then, well, the city doesn't get their $125, but suddenly you have a parking space that maybe you can rent by the hour for that month, and that's going to be at a higher rate. And lastly, no one's forced to pay for parking, right? If, in fact, you don't have a lot of money and you really have to drive, your situation doesn't change at all. You still drive. So, and you can tweak this in different ways to make sure it's revenue neutral. I'm giving you a very broad brush picture of it. All I'm saying is that there are ways around this, right? That we should have sort of soft hearts for people who don't have high incomes, and we should do things to help them, but we shouldn't feel like the only way we can help them is to take a commodity and make all of it free, right? Because you're going to end up helping higher income people much more than lower income people by doing that. So, all right, I'm at the end. So I think there's quick conclusions. Obviously, parking is totally essential to downtown health. And there is this conflict constantly between sort of, we're going to make it available, we're going to make it cheap, can we make money off it? Available is always more important than cheap, right? That the most important thing you can do is make sure that when people come to your downtown, they find a space. And they don't resent you for giving you, they don't resent you for taking money because they feel like they're getting something back. And that's going to give you revenue. This is a perishable good. The story of perishable goods in the economics literature, the business literature, is you manage it first, then you add more supply, because adding supply is really expensive. That doesn't mean that you never add more supply. It just means try some other things first is the general consensus. And then, of course, again, as I mentioned, that your parking policy should always serve the downtown, not vice versa. I think it's really easy, because parking is so visible, to get caught up in, we have a parking problem, we need more parking. I just keep sight of, well, it's not something on its own. Right? It's a relatively low-value land use, and it can be a very important way to get people to high-value land uses. But if you spend a lot of resources just trying to get more parking, then you've sort of flipped your priorities. The first priority is all the things that parking lets you go enjoy. It's not just, we need more parking. All right, I think I've said everything I know, so I will end here, and I'm happy to take questions.
Hi, thank you for that presentation. It was actually very interesting. I had never thought about pricing for occupancy and the need to always have spaces available. I think that's an interesting concept. Now, I'm on the city council, so I get to dream this stuff every night, unfortunately. What you didn't really get to is, if we're already at 90% and we price for occupancy, which puts us at 85, we have less cars, we have less business downtown. It's a depressing factor. At some point, we have to make the decision to create more parking spaces after we've already gone through the step of optimizing the spaces. And so could you spend maybe a minute and talk about what's the appropriate approach for analyzing when it's time to build more parking spaces?
Sure. So with respect to your first point, going from 90 to 85, meaning that you have less business, that's not necessarily the case, because if you have it's 90, right, and again, that's an average, that means that for some substantial period of time, you're probably totally full. And that's the peak times. And when you're totally full, that's when you're losing business. So I guess this goes back to this idea that the average occupancy can be a little bit deceiving, and it's possible that if your average of 85% or average of 80% means more turnover, right, and out of spaces, you could actually have more people flowing through your stores with that lower occupancy rate. I mean, the reason why 100% occupancy is troubling is because it suggests immobile cars.
Okay, so what you're suggesting then, it's not running. So what you're suggesting then is the occupancy rate doesn't necessarily reflect the turnover. And
right.
So it's really the turnover is what helps the downtown business, but it's the occupancy rate which allows people to come in and get what they want, which is a parking space.
Yeah, so the occupancy rate is kind of a useful heuristic, right? I mean that if you're measuring your average occupancy and it's at 85%, the inference you make, right, is that okay, most of the time there's an empty space, and that means folks can get in. That means turnover is happening because there is an empty space, which means a lot of people are cycling through your downtown and probably your stores. The point I was making about the sort of how the average is deceiving is that the longer the interval over which you measure that average, the less accurate that heuristic becomes, right? Which is why it's more useful to think about and why it's more useful to price sort of in these 3-hour chunks than to say this is my average occupancy over afternoon and evening, weekdays and weekends, because what can happen is you miss a lot of activity that happens within that.
So my other part of the question, which is, what are the driving factors for deciding to build more parking if you determine you actually want to provide more?
So I think that if you do sort of price and get your vacancy rate, get to the point where you do have a lot of regular vacancy, and people are just not comfortable with how high that price is, then you might want to think about it. But the word of caution I would put in place is that if you have an average of 85% occupancy and the price is $7 an hour, which I don't think it would become, by definition, at least some people are comfortable with that because they're paying it, right? You're 85% occupied. But it may be that you reach a consensus that says, well, we want to build another parking structure because we think there's another market of customers out there that would are willing to come spend money in our stores but aren't willing to pay that much. But the reason why I said that first do is get your street parking right, and fiddle with your parking in any existing off street is because you want to open up the possibility too that some private people will do some of your work for you, right? I mean, you don't want to crowd out the private sector, and that if you do have a situation where you're metered up nicely and your off street is also being priced accurately, well, that's when you have the typical private goods situation where someone can say, I have a parking lot that the city made me build because of parking requirements, and as long as the street's free after 8 p.m. and the municipal, it's not worth it for me to put someone out there at 8 p.m. and collect money, right? Because I'm competing against free goods. But if that changes, then what you might see is a lot of people who own parking lots right now start turning them into little businesses. And if you can do that and solve your problem without taxpayer money, you might as well wait and see if that happens. I guess that would be my answer.
Thank you.
How far are people willing to walk from a central garage?
It really, there's no easy answer to that. I think that some people will say there's this quarter-mile rule, which is often used for transit as well. Like a person will walk a quarter mile, and then they'll start getting upset about it. But I think that when people dive into it a little bit more, it really depends on the walking environment. That if the environment's very hostile and it's just speeding cars and there's nothing to look at, people won't walk 2 blocks. But if you're walking through a nice area, it's a downtown, people will walk 3/4 of a mile. So I to put one number on it.
Thank you so much for this informative presentation. It comes at a perfect time. I have a couple questions. One, I didn't hear much about the differentiation between the people frequenting downtown who may be just coming in versus residents who don't live in close enough proximity to downtown to have it be walkable and needing to come in. Because we hear a lot of times that policy tends to be downtown centric, and neighborhoods that are outliers can't get in as easily. And if the on-street parking goes way up, maybe the visitors are willing to pay that, but the residents don't want to pay it. Could you speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's that's an issue in a lot of places, and especially a lot of places that get a lot of tourism. And I think it's an understandable concern. I think that, and this goes back to, you can, especially with these new meters and with sort of easy parking, like cards and so forth, you can cut residents a break. And it's a matter of trial and error, I think, that because you don't want to give residents such a big break that they end up just sitting in all the spaces, because you do have a very visitor-based economy. But at the same time, you can do something for them that makes them feel like, they haven't totally lumped in with folks who don't live here. I think there's a larger issue that, again, I don't know Portsmouth very well, but I used to, right when I got out of college, I worked on Nantucket Island for a while, and there was a big concern there where people who lived on the island didn't feel like the downtown belonged to them at all because, it was just like people selling cashmere and $200 dinners and everything. But I guess the point I'm making is that it's an issue separate from the price of parking. I think that in many tourist communities, people feel like their downtown belongs to someone else. But Nantucket doesn't charge for parking at all. I mean, the issue is really just that lunch costs $40, not that parking costs $2. But I think you can go. That's not to diminish your concern. And I think that with new technology, you can cut residents a break and make it a little bit easier for them to go down and compete with people who are by definition kind of coming into town to spend a lot of money.
And just to follow up, the role for redundancy, we have one public parking garage that's going to need infrastructure improvements, and as you know, we're debating building a second. So if that garage has to be offline for a period of time, then we've lost a ton of capacity there. Is there any role, the relative importance of having some redundancy in the system given some of those concerns?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, redundancy is always valuable. It's the question of how far are you going to go to get it? Do you want to build a whole nother structure just in case yours goes offline? You'd have to look kind of precisely at your estimates of, who's in these garages, what would happen if in fact it did close. My gut is, and this is, sort of informed speculation, is that because building a structure is so expensive, you wouldn't want to do it just in case your existing structure closed. That you would try to manage that with a little bit of pricing and things like that first.
Then just one follow-up. We obviously have lots of employees who are hospitality workers who work at odd hours and don't live within walkable distance to town. So carpooling is not an option. Do you have examples of communities where hospitality tourism is a big part of the downtown, and you actually have private business owners who are paying to lease spaces for their employees?
I don't know. I don't. Not in hospitality places. I mean, I think that, again, unless you consider some of these places in California, like, Santa Monica or Redondo Beach or something where this program is a state law, then, yeah, that's sort of in effect. I guess I didn't follow why carpooling wouldn't work.
Odd shifts. So you have odd shifts where you're on the lunch shift or late evening shift and trying to find, you live in Dover, trying to find someone who's on the same shift feels not very feasible in many cases.
Yeah, I mean, I think I could see it would be harder, but since if you do have a hospitality-based economy, and again, this is just me sort of, I don't know anything about Portsmouth, but thinking about my time on Cape Cod and so forth, there tends to be a lot of people who work at that hour, right? Because the restaurants are all open at the same time and so forth. And most of the research on carpooling suggests that forming a carpool seems like it's too much work simply because the alternative is so easy, right? That when there is sort of, hey, we could get $150 extra, you find someone pretty, it's not to say everyone could find it, but a little more effort gets put into it, and you do realize that this guy 2 restaurants over goes to work at the same time as you and doesn't live that far. And if you both carpool, you can split an extra $75, you can each take $75 a month extra. It's not going to work for everybody. It is a tough problem.
Professor, you seem to have touched on this a little bit. Downtown is very, very expensive. Do you think that there are other ways that we can provide housing in downtown, knowing what you know about a community that is historic in its nature? We've been talking about small-sized housing. We've been talking about housing on liner buildings with whatever garage we might build. We've been talking about providing more apartments in smaller houses. What do you have as an assessment for that, knowing that you think that the better use for downtown might be housing instead, or other kinds of buildings other than parking?
Well, again, I mean, I can't say too much about Portsmouth. I think most American cities make it far too difficult to build small housing, and I think that's particularly true in downtowns. And as I mentioned briefly, I think that parking requirements play a big role in that. That, you know, particularly when you're aiming for a sort of lower end of the market that may or may not own vehicles, and it's a small. What you want to do when you build small housing, right, is that you build volume, right, and then you sell it. You sell it to more people for lower rent. That gets harder to do when every unit has to come with a parking space. It gets harder to do for engineering reasons. It's harder to work on the parcel. It gets harder to do just in terms of getting a loan, because you're going to the developer's going to the bank and saying, yeah, this building's going to be aimed for someone who wants to live in 250 square feet and owns more than one vehicle. And the banker's going to be like, that person doesn't exist. Like, you're not getting a loan. So I think that I do, you know, the housing issue all throughout the Northeast is very difficult. But I think one step that you can take that's fairly harmless is to make it a little easier for developers to build for a lower end of the market, and they will do it, right? Like, you know, if you have zoning that says you got to build for the luxury end of the market, then you're going to say, oh my God, people only build for the luxury end of the market. But you can get rich selling housing to people who don't make a lot of money, right? Lots of developers have done it. And that's it. And if that's an unexploited niche that's just being prevented through regulations, then you can revisit your regulations.
Okay, now that we've worked our way through the city council members. So one of the challenges that we have here in Portsmouth is just right outside of our downtown area, the businesses, it changes immediately to residential areas that are very dense, don't have a lot of off-street parking. So by their nature, those areas you want to have essentially free parking, the intent being that it's going to be used by the residents of those areas. However, under your market-based approach, now the value of those spaces potentially increases, because if you increase the cost of the downtown parking, that free parking that's right there and is easily walkable becomes an issue. What have you seen in other communities? Have you seen similar challenges, and how have they overcome them?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the typical response is to do some sort of permit district, where, you know, only residents can park there. You know, I think that's, you know, I guess the plus of that is that it solves the problem, right? The downside of that is twofold. One is that you know, you are sort of privatizing a public good, right? It's the street space belongs to everyone. It's been paid for by everyone, and now only if you happen to own private property on that street are you allowed to park there. So you might shortchange other people in the city who paid for that parking space and can't use it. The other downside to it is that you run the risk of underuse, right? That you don't want to you know, certainly residents, you know, you don't want them feeling like they can't park on their own street, but if they're all off at work during the day, you don't want to have such a stringent permit system in place that folks who are willing to walk a little bit more and would park on that street and walk into town and spend some money can't do it. So there's, you know, I think one sort of idea that's been kicked around is making these sort of hybrid, right? That you could actually meter those neighborhoods with the residents exempt. And something like that. And of course, you know, dedicate the revenue, or at least some portion of that revenue, to that neighborhood. And so, you know, that no one wants a meter in front of their house unless they don't have to pay it and they get the money. I mean, and you wouldn't give them the money, but you would say, look, this is going to get spent on your street. If we raise X amount of money on your street, then it goes into this fund, and, you know, the power lines you don't like, we'll bury them or whatever. And so I do think that you don't want to. So the shortest answer, permit districts. That's what most people do. But my longer answer is you can probably improve on that and get some more use out of those spaces and still keep your residents happy?
So you're obviously helping us to think much more rigorously and creatively about when and where people park and the possibility of carpooling. The piece I haven't heard as strongly is about public transportation. And it seems to me that part of the answer to the first question is, in fact, not when do we invest in parking, but how do we make decisions about the trade-off between investments in public transportation versus parking. We happen to have a nice bus system. Some lines are under serious consideration to be cut. The buses don't run enough for a lot of people who would like to use them. And maybe, I'm sure the mathematics is not simple, but you could probably speak to it a little bit.
Well, I'm sure I can't speak to the math of your bus system, but I think that I guess the one way to think about this is that the biggest problem that faces public transportation in the United States has nothing to do with public transportation agencies. It's just the fact that driving is so inexpensive, right? That people don't ride transit in the U.S. because driving is unbelievably cheap, right? You know, in Germany costs like, you know, the gas tax in Germany is $3.75 a gallon, right? That's why people there ride transit. It's not because the transit systems are so much better, although that's true too. And so I think that if you did right price your parking and did nothing at all to your buses, you'd see more people on them, right? Whether you should also use the parking revenue to fund your bus system is a political question, right? And the fact of the matter is that in the U.S., most people don't use transit. Most people don't value transit. I'm not one of those people, but as long as that's true, then you're not going to get the political support potentially that you need to meter if you say we're going to spend it on something almost no one uses, right? So that's not necessarily the way I would like the world to be, but my experience it is right now that is the way the world is. And so the upside is that if you spend the revenue on something else and you price the driving or the parking accurately, transit is still helped. Yes, it would be nice if we could also pour some more money into it, but that might be a tougher row to hoe.
First of all, I'd like to thank you for coming. I have a little bit of a cold, so bear with the sound that's coming from the mic. I was wondering if you would actually be eligible to be adopted for 6 months. We have a lot of issues that are here, and some of the stuff really makes sense. Last summer, we actually introduced a pilot program for satellite parking. It was for roughly about 100 spaces, and I tend to think it worked well. And the pilot is a test run. It's not something that you go based on a 12-month series. You had gone and mentioned as far as with the parking and some of the problems that we have is based on time. We also have a big thing on seasonal. You know, we run out of room for parking, and when the snow fills in. But as we become more of a vacation destination, I mean, the people come in abundance. I'm just kind of curious at what your thoughts are with the satellite parking. There might be some options. Some people are willing to talk more than others, but if I could get your take on that.
So the idea of like having a lot on the outskirts and then shuttling people in. Yeah, I think it can work, but it's not the root source of the problem, right? That's sort of I mean, it's similar to maybe to transit or something like that. It's something that's going to work a lot more effectively if the places where the demand for the parking is very high, the price reflects that. As long as the price isn't keeping up with the demand in the places where people really want to be, you know, too many people, their first option is going to be, I'm going to go downtown, I'm going to look for that great parking spot. And then once they're there, it's difficult mentally to say, now I'm going to drive out to the satellite lot and get on a bus and come all the way back in. You're just going to keep circling. So I think that if people know ahead of time that this really is a trade-off, right, that I'm going to go to that satellite lot, I'm going to sit on a bus, but I'm going to save some money and maybe some hassle, then they're more likely to just do that straight off. And so I think it's something that really nicely complements accurately pricing your other parking, but on its own, it can have benefits, but not as big as they might otherwise be.
It's cheaper than a parking garage. It's another substitute before going and spending millions of dollars. You know, your example of $20,000 per space, we're looking right now at a project that could cost somewhere between $38,000 and $40,000 per space.
Yeah, I mean, so and there's no question it would be less expensive, absolutely. But again, I think that and so if you're just thinking about dollars and cents, that's cheaper. But I think that if you really want to get back down to this point of like comprehensively delivering a great service to people who are coming to Portsmouth, your first step is this right pricing.
Oh. Hi. Could you speak a little bit more about the myth you were describing about the occupancy rates at, for example, our parking garage you said was closed or was full 200 times a year. That's not exactly the case because it's only full during certain times of day. It strikes me that what the times of day when the parking lot or the garage is not full is not particularly relevant because the time when, I mean, who cares if the lot is empty at midnight? Nobody wants to park there anyway. I care about at noon when I leave work and I want to go downtown for lunch. That 2.5 hour block of time is in my mind the only important time. So what's the benefit to looking at it across a longer period of time?
So the only benefit to it is to remind you that if you were to address that problem by building an entirely new structure, the structure would be there. You would be solving this 2.5 hour problem with a 24-hour sort of permanent structure, which may not be the wisest use of that land, right? Because if you just because at lunchtime you have a hard time finding a parking space, you take a block of valuable downtown land and turn it into a parking structure. I mean, it's one could argue that you're sort of going after a thumbtack with a sledgehammer. That you might be better off understanding that a lot of people want to park at noon, or a lot of people want to be downtown at noon, and that maybe if it costs $2 to park downtown at noon, it should cost $3. And what you might find is that 100% occupancy rate at noon turns into 85.
What? So just to follow up, I don't get that. So it drops to 85. Where are those people parking? Are they deciding to eat lunch somewhere else? Because we don't want that.
Well, again, it depends on how long they were staying before, right? So it might be that, they might be finding their way downtown some other way, right? Rather than 3 people driving down. We're going to meet downtown, and we'll all park in the structure. Say, oh, the price went up. We're going to all jump in the same car. It might be that some of them don't go downtown, right? But someone else probably will, right, who's willing to pay. It might be that someone jumps on their bike. It might be that someone goes to lunch at 2 p.m. instead of noon, right? You might spread the peak a little bit. I agree with you that it's not going to end up happening at midnight, but you could find that, if the rate doesn't go up sort of until 11 and ends, higher at 2, maybe someone goes to lunch at 2. People react to higher all different ways. It's very hard to predict ahead of time how they're going to do it. But again, what you don't want to think about the fact that the garage is full, meaning that a lot of business is happening, right? Because it could just mean that people are there for a long time.
Okay, fair enough. One more quick question. The other thing that I think is particular to the Seacoast region is that and a woman who was speaking before alluded to it, is that we have so many of our workers, hospitality workers and otherwise, who are driving in from all the satellite communities that are fed by Portsmouth. These aren't people who, you propose solutions like walking downtown. I mean, that's not, no one's going to walk from Newmarket or Durham to downtown, nor really is it feasible for most of those folks to ride their bikes. So it just strikes me that that's maybe not germane to our situation here. It's really expensive to live within walking/biking distance of downtown. So there are a lot of workers who are looking for places to park for the day, and I'm sure they'd love to live downtown and walk to work. I'm sure they'd love to bike to work, but it's just not financially feasible for that to happen.
Sure. Well, so I guess 2 points. One is that I think when I was talking about the biking and the walking, just in response to your question, that was sort of in response to this lunchtime rush, right? This people who are just going downtown for probably not your workers who are probably getting there at some different hour. The other thing is that I did have this slide about, businesses leasing spaces and cashing them out and so forth that was aimed directly at that problem you just mentioned, right? People who do have to drive or feel like they have to drive and don't have a lot of money. So that would be my answer to that, which is that there are different ways you can deal with this. They don't assume that everyone's going to walk to work, but there are ways you can either cash out the parking or leave it to the individual businesses to decide. I mean, if these workers are that crucial, maybe they should buy them a parking space or give them a raise or.
What do you think about charging rent for a parking space in residential areas? So say, we build a new building that has 8 units and 6 parking spots, and those parking spots are, an extra $150 a month, but not everybody has to buy one.
Yeah, that's it's called unbundled parking. It's a very good idea. The key is that it's only workable. It's generally only workable if the city doesn't require parking, right? Because what often happens when you require parking is that you're gonna force a developer to build some spaces that actually cost more to construct than you could sell them for, and so that if you unbundled them, you'd actually lose money. And so that whole system of you don't have to buy a space, and if you do, it's going to cost X. It only works if the parking is somewhat scarce, right? If the city requires so much parking with residences that they're abundant, the developer really has no choice but to carry that cost with the housing unit.
Hi, I have a question. I'm right here. So I wonder if you could address the possibility of changing traffic patterns and even car accessibility to the center, the city center. So, for example, when you go to the old world, Italy, France, whatever, their city centers are car-free. So people know that they're not going to be able to drive right into the center of town and get out of their car and stumble into the coffee shop. They just know that, and they're prepared to walk. And I wonder if you have comments or examples of other small towns that have tackled that.
Yeah, there are some towns that have done that. I think it's, and I think, sometimes it works really well. It is kind of a separate issue, is so that, I guess what I've just described is based on the idea that you do have a downtown with parking, and as long as you do, how are you going to manage it? It's sort of it's a separate issue as to whether, do we want to have parking at all? And sort of seal off the city center from vehicle traffic. In which case, I think, the best examples are in Europe. There are some places in the U.S. that have maybe come close to doing that, but nothing quite like, what you see in these older cities that have much older built environments that almost by, the thing about the European cities is just the way they were built. It was almost too hard to provide parking to begin with, right? And a lot of American towns, they were developed post-war, and so it was just the parking's there. And so I guess what I'm saying is I'd hesitate to go too far down that road in this venue, not because I don't think it's a worthwhile thing to think about, but just because I really do think they're separate issues, right? Like that you're sort of assuming away parking. And I think the issue we're concerned about here, or at least that I was asked to talk about, is that assuming you have parking, how do we manage it so it is a great service for drivers without causing a lot of other problems? Someone right up front, too. Sure, and then you're next.
You mentioned using funds from parking revenue to construct things like street trees and other types of beautiful along the street. Have you seen any examples of where those funds might have been used to add bike lanes or sidewalks or other alternative modes of travel?
No. And in part that's just because this whole idea has been, most places just don't charge for parking at all, and so there's a relatively limited number of places that have really taken the idea of using the meters and using the revenue in a dedicated way. That the end isn't very big. But I think the second reason is, again, that it's, the point isn't that like it has to be trees or it has to be whatever. It's the point is that it's something that most people value, right? And so, and I think that, again, this isn't my ideal world, but bike lanes are often pretty controversial. And so you do run into some political problems in a lot of places if you say, we're going to take money from drivers and use it to build a bike lane. People get mad. And I think what you don't want to do in this situation is if people are suspicious enough of parking meters is start a fight over how the revenue is going to be used. So if you're in a community where everyone's behind the idea of a bike lane, then the bike lane is the perfect thing to use the revenue for. But if you're in the community where they don't like bike lanes, then maybe you should find a different way to finance the bike lane that's not going to sacrifice your ability to manage your parking well. So it's just, you just want to find consensus. If you're in a town where everybody wants a herd of zebras, then like use the meter revenue to get some zebras. But like, it's just, you just want to have agreement.
Thanks for being here. Portsmouth has provided parking in different places beyond the garage, and they've come up with the plan that Heinemann Press is just a few blocks out of downtown. You can park there at night. I think most people I've talked to who live downtown don't even know about it. I think we have other places that are available, like out Market Street, just probably a little less than a mile from downtown. And I think they're underutilized, and that's part of managing what needs to happen here first. When Jeff Speck came, he talked about having the discussion on what our values are first to make that decision. And I don't know if that's part of what you think we need to do first before we make decisions.
Yeah, I mean, I'm personally a value-free person. I'm an economist, but but I think communities should have values. Absolutely. I think that goes back to. I did allude to that a little bit, and I don't mean to joke in your in the slide where I said that do we want to subsidize parking for employees? Well, that's a political decision, right? Absolutely. What the kind of thing I study is sort of means given ends, right? That once you've decided what your ends are, there might be better and worse ways to do them, right? That's the analytical side of this. Is like once you've decided you're going to have this kind of parking, and it's going to be for these people. How can we manage it? Is there a better and worse to do it? Yes, but I have nothing to say at all about what any community's ends are, right? That's the political process at work. And so, yeah, you guys absolutely have to come together and figure out what you want to do, and then bring in consultants or eggheads or whatever, advise you on the best way to do it. But that's something that's really something you guys absolutely have to work out. I would be of no help at all.
Yeah, speaking of Jeffrey Speck, when he was here, he discussed the concept of induced demand, and he was talking about the concept of when you build bigger and better roads and other infrastructure, what you're really doing is encouraging bigger and better traffic and congestion problems. Does that concept, in your opinion, apply to parking infrastructure as well? And if not, why not?
It does. I mean, it's sort of a, it applies, I guess the way that I would put it, it applies to any valuable resource that is left underpriced, right? That's all traffic congestion is unpriced roads, right? That the roads are valuable real estate, and the price that we charge drivers to use them doesn't reflect that value, and so every morning we have a shortage of them. And so if you keep building, right, and you can't keep up with that demand because you leave the price at zero, you see more driving, or you see driving redistributed to that new road space. And the exact same thing would happen with parking spaces, so long as that whatever opportunities or activities those parking spaces give you access to are very valuable, and the price to occupy that parking space doesn't reflect that value, then yes, building more is just going to fill them up more. Sure.
Well, thank you very much. Michael Manville. There's time to socialize afterward. The bar will be open over there. We should have said that earlier. but it's dangerous to combine parking and drinking. Thank you very much.